All right, thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and thank you for sticking with us through our technical difficulties right now. And yes, again, welcome to the Artist Talks for the exhibitions. For those of us joining on Zoom, just please keep your volume on mute, and you can type your questions about that you have for the artists into the chat as we go. And if you need transcripts, Otter is provided at the top bar of your Zoom window. Okay, so yes, my name is Rachel Vera Steinberg. I have recently started as the curator and director of exhibitions here at SMAC Mellon. I'm really excited to be here, despite all of our technical difficulties, to present my first event at SMAC Mellon with these two amazing shows. Thank you, Audrey Irving, Lulu Meng, Kathleen Gilrain, and especially thank you to Gabriel de Guzman, the chief curator at Wave Hill, who came back to SMAC Mellon as a special guest to be in dialogue today with J.C. Lenahan about his exhibition. So we're going to start with a discussion between J.C. and Gabriel, and then we're going to move over into the other space to see Katya's exhibition, and then I'll be in dialogue with her there. So thank you, Gabriel and J.C. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining us for these artist talks. As Rachel mentioned, I'm Gabriel de Guzman. I'm SMAC Mellon's former director of exhibitions, and I'm the curator of the two current shows. And I'm really glad to be back here today to lead this discussion with J.C. Lenahan and his exhibition. A disciplinary artist who's had recent solo shows. Gantt Center in Charleston, Illinois, and Harvey B. Gantt Center, Charlotte, North Carolina. Artist residencies and fellowships include Art Omi, Denniston Hill, the Newark Museum, Fountainhead, Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, and open sessions of the Drawing Center, and others. He is the recipient of the Pollock-Krasner Grant, Franklin Furnace Grant, Puffin Foundation Grant, and the New Jersey Council of the Arts Fellowship Grant. He earned an MFA from Rutgers University Mason Gross School of Art, and he's also attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. And surprisingly, this is his first solo show in New York City, so we're very proud of that. Welcome, JC. So I think people who are seeing your work for the first time might assume that you've made this body of work in response to the recent Black Lives Matter movement and the protests against racial injustice. But you've really been doing this for many years now. And I remember actually I visited your Elizabeth Foundation studio, your EFA studio, probably been about 10 years now. Time flies. And I was really struck by this compelling work that you're making that's explore and investigate these very complicated issues around race and class, and finding compelling ways to approach those topics. And so I wanted to start with this body of work, these small drawings, which are collectively called Bearing Witness, Keeping It Above 100, right? Yeah. Because it really sort of showcases a lot of the different topics that you've been investigating and the different types of imagery that you've been making over a good portion of your career. And so there are images that are like the boxing imagery, and there's also some of the text-based or works that we'll be talking about with some of the other works in the show. But I want to kind of focus on some of the imagery that's looking at historical representation and misrepresentation in your work. So, for example, this figure is Geronimo, right? And do you want to talk about this figure and how you're sort of looking at historical representation through your work?
Sure. I mean, all of this is really my way of questioning things. So even the title itself is a question for me. The images, I mean, I see images, I see words as images, right? But I also see images as a way to bear witness. And I think we're all witnessing, in a sense, the fall of white supremacy. So I think through the media or through a collection of thoughts or just through conversations, I collect these images and then I see them as a way to transmit, to translate, to transform our way of seeing this thing unfolding before us. So, I mean, if we look at this image here, I started a new series called New Landscapes. And I think about the idea of protest. And I think back to the first protest that I participated in, which was, I was probably 17 years old. And it was in Los Angeles after the Rodney King. So those kind of things are very important as far as how I see the world and how I see myself in it. But also how I think these are a way of me questioning, but also trying to instigate some sort of conversation about the conversations that I have with my friends every day. So that's one way of seeing it. Yeah.
And do you mind if we look at a couple more images? So what is this depicting, this scene right here?
This image is from, it's actually Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1921, the most prosperous Black community in this country was basically firebombed. And I've always wanted to use this image because I remember when Timothy McVeigh, I went to college at the University of Oklahoma. So I remember when Timothy McVeigh did what he did with the federal building in Oklahoma City. The headline was something about the largest bombing in US history. And that's absolutely not true. The largest bombing in US history was Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Right? So those kind of things always interest me, but it's also a way of me questioning what this thing called whiteness is. Right? So in the 90s, we saw almost an explosion with literary giants like Toni Morrison and others writing about this thing called whiteness. So it's a way of me questioning what that is.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we can the entire these images and it would take up the whole talk.
Right.
So maybe we should move on to some of the other work in the show. Can we talk about the some of these book sculptures that you've made? So you're a longtime public high school teacher, and a lot of your work is about sort of challenging educational systems and pedagogy. And you often use iconic symbols of the classroom, like books, school desks, chalkboards, in your work. Can we, just using the books as an example, can you talk about what you're investigating here, the way that you're, the books are bound together with concrete and basically cemented shut in a way.
Well,
Anyway, tell me about this. Yeah.
I'm interested in the way things are discarded. Right? As being a high school teacher and an adjunct professor, I'm just as concerned as what's not happening in the classroom as to what is happening in the classroom. Right? So I think ideologically speaking, we learn what the dominant culture wants us to learn, and nothing more and nothing less. So I'm always questioning that within the classroom, but also outside of the classroom. I mean, I think if we talk about critical discourse, and the way information is either diluted or completely excluded, these works started with me thinking about the way information is discarded. So I find these books, and then I'm looking at not only the interior of the book, but also the narrative that's created by the titles of the books, right? And I think it's important to talk about the origins of things. So when I first heard this thing called whiteness, I wanted to know, like, what is the origins of this thing, right? What is the origins of people calling themselves white, right? Like, I want to know what is the origin, because to me it's something that's never sat well with me, and never, you know, when you're taught something and you know something is not right. Like, I can't remember ever, like, I grew up with a single mother, right? My father was, well, let's just say he wasn't present. But I never remember my mother ever saying anything about "you're white" or "we're white." But I remember when I got to college one time and all the white kids asked me, "How do you know all the black people?" So I wanted to know, like, well, I just responded by try saying hello, right? So I've never understood this idea of race, right? So if you look at it, 1641 is the first time there was this thing called white, right? So rich white people had to figure out how to get poor white people on their team. So they created this thing called white, right? But before that, no one had ever called themselves white. So I think about the origins of race, right? It's a social construct, but I think what's more important is for us to talk about cultural value and cultural awareness. And I think race does the direct opposite of that. Yeah, I mean, and the reason I started using concrete was I'm interested in using materials that have somehow held a place in shaping history. So whether we talk about architecture or whether we talk about information, like, those things have held weight in shaping history and how we view ourselves and how we view others. So even the origins, like the origins of race or the origins of concrete. Like, if you go to Rome invented concrete, right? So I'm interested in also this malleable material that hardens right in front of you, right? And there's nothing you can do about it. Like, once it hardens, it's there, right? So I'm also with these interested in taking things out of its normal circulation or its normal context and placing it in a completely different context, in a completely different source of circulation. So these used to be in institutions and now they're in galleries. So I'm interested in that sort of transmission or that sort of transformation, right?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting that you're doing in these sculptures is you can still read the titles and the authors' names and the titles. Some of the titles draw you in, like "Easy to Kill" or "I Am the Darker Brother," you know,
Or harmless people.
Yes.
Well, even
Harmless
like,
people. Yeah.
even when I look at this book right here called "It All Started with Columbus," every time I see a mass shooting, I think about Columbus. Because I think about if you celebrate violence, the direct response to that violence will be violence. So if you teach to commemorate or to celebrate violence, what is the psychological impact of pedagogical structure? What is the psychological impact of us being divided into races? What is the psychological impact of us learning to commemorate violence? So if you teach violence, that's exactly what you get in return, right?
Yeah. Can we move over to this large look over here? This is sort of a large chalk drawing of factory buildings or machine. And again, you're kind of using the chalk and the blackboard as, you know, this sort of icon of like classroom learning, right? But you've depicted this really strange looking machine. Can you tell us what it is and what it's meant to do?
So I personally work in Newark, New Jersey, right? But I take the train every day from South Orange, New Jersey to New York or to Newark, right? But if you take the train, the transit, you'll pass when you get to 280 and Broad Street, across 280, you'll see this structure, and it's called colonial concrete, right? So it's a concrete factory, right? So every day when I would pass this on the train, I would think about colonial concrete. Like those are two things that I'm interested in, concrete and decolonization, right? So again, I mean, even the idea of concrete and colonization, concrete is part of us being colonized, right? Because think about where we're standing right here. Like what was standing here 500 years ago? It's certainly, we weren't standing on concrete, right? So it's also this idea of nature too, right? But in the process of decolonization, there's a book by Ivan Illich called Deschooling Society, right? So in reading that text and using it as a reference source, I've always thought about how do we de-race a society? Like how do we put more emphasis on cultural value and cultural inclusion and less emphasis on race, right? Because I think race does nothing but divide us, right? So I'm thinking about inclusion, and I'm thinking about representation, and I'm thinking about how can I transform this structure into something more positive, right? So me thinking about transforming this, I just took the same structure, and again, I'm interested in like deconstructing things and then reconfiguring them the way I think that they should be viewed or interacted with. So basically, I just added modern amenities to the colonial concrete and transformed it into a structure that could possibly de-race us, right? So there's also an element of humor in it too, right? Because I think humor is very important when we're talking about these complex issues, right? I almost look at it as good comedy. Right? Good comedy is going to make you laugh and think at the same time. So this is also about a process of rethinking possibilities. So I've added an escalator. So the idea is that you take the escalator and there's these chambers that you walk into that transform you and de-race sort of the psychological impact of colonialism, right? And then adding these slides is also another element of humor, right? To where if you're fixed or transfixed or decolonized, right, then, you know, you can basically leave. But there's also this element, this circular or ubiquitous element that allows you to revisit it, right? So it's also, you know, it's the water and then it comes back into this conveyor. It's back into the chamber or the structure.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about this idea of de-racing because, I mean, I do believe that I've always thought that race is largely a social construct. You know, like these ideas of
A divisive,
yeah, and
social
divisive,
construct.
and it's like a way of
Control.
yeah, and it's a way of defining otherness, right?
But also minimizing importance too.
Yeah.
Right? Or people's contributions, right? It's almost like if you look at the idea of prehistory, like I've never understood what that means. And to me, what it means, like thinking about social discourse or critical discourse, and prehistory negates African contributions to civilizations, period. To me, it should be called pre-European thought, right? Because during the Ice Age, it was the golden age in Africa. So if we look at the origins of humanity, that's another thing. Like I started a series called the Melanin Chronicles because all of us have melanin, right? Some of us have more than others, but the origins of humanity, like there's no anthropologist alive that can negate the origins of humanity being in Africa, period.
Yeah.
So all of us must have some sort of relationship to Africa.
Yeah, no, and I think that,
And that's just being a global citizen. Like, I don't think in this country we teach geography, right? Every year I do this project where I hand my students a blank map of the world to see how many countries we can identify out of the 195 or 198 countries that are on the earth. Because I think that's important, but I think in this country that we see ourselves as something greater than something else, right? So it's not important, right? To be, I mean, all the great minds of the world are international thinkers. The problem in this country is we're domesticated thinkers. Some of us don't even know that Philadelphia is south of here, right? Because it's not important, right? To some, right?
yeah, yeah.
But even the idea of otherness, there's a great book called Art and Otherness, that talks about, how divisive race is, but also how in the modern era of art that, the other was anything other than white, right? But in the area that we live in, right, that sort of thing through generational consciousness has shifted, where now white is the other, right? And we can debate that all day long, but.
Yeah, and I think that those ideas have been so ingrained in us, generation after generation throughout history. And
Well, race is a prescription. And I just think we have to be careful about what we're subscribing to.
yeah, and I want to kind of talk about how you're sort of trying to, dismantle some of these ideas, or at least challenge them.
No, dismantle is a good word, but
Yeah.
deconstruct it and reconfigure it the way where we become more inclusive culturally, right? Because the idea of cultural inclusion always interests me, or cultural value. We don't put enough emphasis on cultural value. We put more emphasis on race, which again is a prescription.
Can we talk about the text space that's over here on this wall? Because I think that a lot of these speak to this idea of calling out whiteness and white supremacy and what that means, and how that's been used as a tool to for like subjugation and marginalizing and othering people.
But I think it's important that when we talk about language, that we talk about egalitarianism, right?
Mhm.
Or we talk about, there's two books that are very important, Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, who talks about in the first chapter about make sure that you transform this in the era that you live. So he had this foresight to know that things change, right? And all he did was show the Brazilian government during colonialism how to show illiterate farmers how to read by allowing those farmers to teach him how to farm. So I always tell my students that if I don't learn just as much from you as I show you, then this is not education, it's something else. In other words, I don't know anything, right? I've just been here a little bit longer and I've maybe read a little bit more, right? But that's only because like, to me, I think every time I walk into a classroom, I want to transform what that means, right? It's the same way where I was just talking to Lulu about this idea of art. Like, I don't even look at myself as an artist. I look at it as we're visual thinkers, right? And we're here to transform what this thing called art can mean. But there's another book called Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, right? So those two books are instrumental in how I approach the classroom and how I approach the studio, right? So these come from some of the quotes that I used, but also a student looked at me one time and was like, why are you always quoting someone else and why don't you ever quote yourself in your work? So it's those kind of conversations that are transformative, right? If we're listening, right? And I think about, when I'm in a classroom, I think about the art of listening, right? And to me, I call this, if this is art, because I take it as a compliment when someone says, I don't know if what you create is art. That's a compliment to me, Because I don't know what art is. Like to me, like Gabriel said something about the patriarch in art. And I think the whole concept of art is patriarchal, right? So to me, that's what I mean by transforming it into something maybe matriarchal, right? I have 2 small daughters and I grew up with women, right? So there were no males. I had no male guidance at all. So I was reading a book with one of my daughters, and in the book it said the future is female. So I just thought, yeah, it is, right? And so one of my students asked me, do I believe that, right? And I wouldn't make it if I didn't believe it, right? I wouldn't create something that I didn't believe in, right? And I do think that, because I do think the patriarch is over, right? Just like I feel like white supremacy is over. So this whole exhibition is questioning like, what's after? Like, what's our world without white supremacy? I even tell the people that I know that identify as being white, stop calling yourself that. Like, if you're about ending racism, then stop calling yourself white. If you're really about that, right, find something else to call yourself, right? Because I think every time you identify as being quote unquote white, you reinforce the ideals of white supremacy, even if it's unconsciously, right? So all of these came from sort of doing the reverse process of what I normally do, which is like taking these old art journals and these old pages from books and allowing that to be the surface, and then spelling out what I want to say, and then covering it with concrete. And before it hardens, pulling off the letters where it creates this embossment. And also, like, I'm interested in the whole dichotomy between abstract and concrete thinking, right? The difference between fact and fiction, right? So,
Yeah, I feel like the process of creating this work is very important, and the way that you're excising the letters that have been embedded, and then it's sort of a subtractive process in a way.
yeah.
And it sort of speaks to these ideas or these questions that you're working with, and thinking about like visibility and invisibility, and sort of speaking your voice, but then being silenced.
Well, there's also this idea of reduction, right? This idea of working reductively, right? It's the same with the drawings, right? Is it like, I'll put it on there and then I erase. It's like, I think the foundation to all art is math and science, right? So I always think like, you know, the difference between drawing and mathematics is in mathematics, you're using numbers, right? In drawings, you're using lines, but the process is the same, right? Is that you're just adding and subtracting lines when you're making a drawing, right? So.
And can we just talk about this one in particular? So going back to what you were saying before about that, a lot of this work is looking at like what happens after,
Right.
After this idea of whiteness.
Well, even when I question the idea of whiteness, there's a book called "Who's Afraid of Post-Blackness," right, by Tarble, right? And in reading that book in 2008, I kept thinking about, okay, if we're afraid of post-Blackness, right, which is something that Glenn Ligon and Thelma Golden came up with in conversation, right? Then who's afraid of who's afraid of post-whiteness, right? Because, you know, I'm not afraid. I invite, right, that sort of conversation about what happens after white supremacy, right? So someone asked me, well, what's the definition of post-whiteness? So I thought about it for a long time, from 2008 until I created this in 2012. But it says that interdisciplinary arena of critical inquiry as the social deconstruction of a system ideologically tied to white privilege or social status in order to move towards post-racial. So when we had Obama as our president and people were talking about, oh, we're in a post-racial phase, right? Like, we're so far removed, we're not even, I don't know, like, we're so far removed from being human that I don't even think we really know what it means, right? And that's not my quote, that's Paulo Freire. Like he said, we're so far removed from being human due to our pedagogical makeup right? Due to our pedagogical experience, that we'll never completely understand what it means to be human, right? So in thinking about, I mean, so many things were revealed to us during the Obama era, right? And then, you know, what we've always known was revealed, like the 45th president was nothing new, right? Like everything that was presented to us, to me, there's a beauty in that. Even the fall of white supremacy is a beautiful thing, but it's an ugly process, right? And even like people are like talking about being surprised at what this orange guy was saying in the White House, and there was nothing surprising about that. Like people have been talking about the presence of racism, the prevalence of racism in our lives, but until you see it, until you experience it, will you know? So to me, there was nothing surprising about that. It's just, to me, what's interesting is this idea of cognitive dissonance, right? Where the facts are presented to us, right? Now, if we want to believe in fiction, that's a personal choice, but the facts are in front of us. But the truth is heavy. The truth is heavy. It's kind of like gold, really small, but really heavy, right? So if that answers.
Yeah, I think we have time to talk about one more piece before we should open it up to questions. So let's talk about this punching bag sculpture piece, which has the title of the show embedded into it and doing like this. You use a lot of boxing imagery in your work, punching bags, boxing gloves, and then drawings of boxers in the ring. Can you talk about the use of boxing imagery and what is that a metaphor for something, or how?
Well, I mean, there's something personal about it in that, you know, I grew up, you know, on a wrestling mat and in the boxing ring, but also my uncle taking me to boxing matches in Las Vegas when I was a kid, right? So I'm a huge boxing fan, but I also think about the class issues surrounding boxing. Like how many lives have been saved from poverty with boxing, right? Like someone asked me, what does race have to do with boxing? And I was like, what does it not have to do with, right? The first black heavyweight champion of the world was Jack Johnson in 1910, and he hated white women in 1910. They created an act called the Mann Act because of Jack Johnson, because he was crossing state lines with white women, right? So to me, like the origins of race and the origins of boxing are intertwined, right? So this to me, like, is a contradiction, right? I mean, I started a series called The Gloves Are Off, right? Meaning that we're in this fight, right? But now there's no more rules, right? So the gloves are off, we're not, right? But also this idea of training ourselves, right? I think we have to train ourselves to think differently, right? So whether it's about race or whether it's about culture, to think differently and to train ourselves to think differently. But I think the contradiction is like this is used, you know, there's all kinds of metaphors like stick and move is a saying in boxing, right? But if the idea is to hit and not get hit, right? So this whole thing about agility, right? This whole thing about stamina, right? All of those things are prevalent when we talk about boxing, but also when we talk about race and, you know, sort of disengaging ourselves from this ideological or social construct. Yeah. And the name of the show, I mean, again, it's this question, like I'm always grappling, like I'll make this work until I can no longer make work, right? And people ask me all the time, like, or I've been asked, like, when did this happen? Like I have some disease or something, right? Like when did this happen? And what they're saying is, when did someone who looks like you, who's garnered from, you know, white privilege, like when did this start for you, right? And I think about it. I think about my grandfather was Chickasaw Indian, right? But I don't consider myself Indian, right? Like I have Irish blood, but I don't consider myself Irish. But I think there's a relationship. Like if we look at the IRA, like when McBride came here in the 70s, right, the early 70s, right in City Hall, she was given the key to the city, And she took that key to Harlem and gave it to the Black Panther Party. So there's a book called Blackness and Transatlantic Irish Identity. And it talks about the Irish from Boston going back to Ireland to reclaim their Irish identity and being some of the most racist people in America, and going back to Ireland and walking into a bar in Dublin and seeing a picture of Huey Newton on the wall. So there's this transformation that happens with this whole Irish identity. And they're also talking about Van Morrison, they're talking about U2 knowing the origins of music, right? So when we look at the origins of music, if the origins of humanity are in Africa, then the origins of music must be there too, right?
Yeah.
So there's this direct relationship, and also like Irish in boxing too, right? There's a philosopher named Gantt Diop that talked about if Black people, if Africans would have never left the continent of Africa, the whole world would have remained a desert. Think about that. If Africans would have never left the continent of Africa, the whole world would not be occupied. There's also a book called They Came Before Columbus that talks about the Dogon of Mali trading with indigenous tribes in the Caribbean and in America, right? Before colonialism even happened, before a white man ever came to the West, right? So those kind of things are profound to me, right? Because those kind of things aren't taught in the classroom, right? You have to find those things on your own.
And what would have happened if things had remained that way instead of going down?
Well, you can even say something, yeah, saying an African moving into a different climatic region of the world, nature changed him. Like he was no longer needed the pigment in his skin. He no longer, like nature, the cold changed pigment, it changed eye color, it changed, so.
Yeah. Can we take questions from the audience?
Sure.
Thank you. Thanks, JC. Who has a question for JC? Oh, yes.
Hi, how are you?
Yes.
So much for your time. I was wondering about this class, if you can talk about the placement of the.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, okay. All of these are references to things that I read or study, right? So all of this is heavily research-based. So I read a book called White Trash, right? 400 Years of Class in America, right? And I think when we look at economics, right? When we look at poverty, like even when we talk about the violence in this country, right? Like we wouldn't know violence if we didn't know poverty, right? So the real issue is class, right? Race is a distraction. Race is the prescription for distraction, right? To take us away from the economic structures that create the real issue of class, right? Because even this country wasn't set up for all white people. It was set up for rich white men, period, right? So the reason I placed class is because I wanted it at eye level for the real issue, right? And even the way I've sort of juxtaposed the timing, right? Because I want this to be a ubiquitous conversation, but I also want it to be from coast to coast. So one is East Coast and one is West Coast, to think about that too, right? But also the idea of putting race up top was just to contradict, for someone to ask that question, right? To engage in that conversation. Because that's what this is. This whole thing is about creating the conversation that I think needs to happen, right? So, okay. Thank you.
Question from the Zoom audience.
Okay.
Marianne writes, I love your idea that non-racist and anti-racist white people should stop calling themselves white. Do you have any suggestions or more thoughts about what we should call ourselves?
Well, I think if you look at Toni Morrison's quote here, it says, in this country, American means white because everybody else has to hyphenate. So I don't know, just try to hyphenate. Right? Because then like representation is different. I mean, call yourself Irish American, call yourself Italian American, call yourself something other than white, right? I don't know. I mean, to me, like that's how we transform things, right? That's how we recreate history, right? So I think that is a conversation for a community of white folks to figure out, right?
So from generality to more specific.
Right,
You want to be specific.
Right. Right. Just try it human. I don't know. Like human is a good place to start.
Thank you.
No other
Who
questions?
else has a question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it's not really a question. You know,
We've known each other.
for a long time, so, you know, this is driven by a deep, life early on, you know, and struggles.
Gotcha.
This is very personal.
Yeah.
So I just want to say this, where he's up there with the philosophy and the theory, but this grows from, you know, this is not a question, I'm just describing. This grows from really having experienced poverty. And I want to acknowledge that because all that is, you know, something that came back. And I wanted to see if you agree or disagree or you could expand because when people ask you the question about how do you feel about the work, you know, like when do you get to this point, right? They don't understand that it is the class thing that you come from.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I
And
could
the
make
common
this work.
ground, and the common ground you have.
I don't think I could make this work if it wasn't for where I was,
Yeah,
right? But also me listening to the words and where I grew up. And I remember when and I wrote this in my thesis, that I was we were playing in the street one time and a friend of mine's dad, Andre Lawson's dad, pulled me aside and said, "You're gonna have it rougher than everybody else here. Because he's gonna have a whole community of people that relate to his experience and you're not gonna have anyone." So it's those kind of things from childhood. Me crossing the border, my mother was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico, right? And me growing up, my mother used to always say, my grandmother used to always say, no matter how bad we have it, there's always someone who has it worse, right? So I don't know why, like I didn't know I was poor until I saw other people when I got older, but I think crossing the border when I was in 3rd grade and seeing kids my age, like beating on the car window, asking for food, like half naked. Like there were certain social things that happened when I was a kid, right? Visiting a reservation and seeing Native men with spray paint on their face as a young kid, right? And the reason they had spray paint on their face is because they couldn't afford the alcohol and nicotine that was tax-free, so they were sniffing paint to take themselves away from their social condition. So it's all of the things from my childhood that made, you know, when I was introduced to this idea of art making, there was a relief because I didn't know what to do with this experience or these thoughts, right? So this is why, and I can't stop. Like I don't have to come up with any ideas. I have to keep them, right? That's the most difficult part, right? So
thank you. Yeah, I think. Thank you so much, Stacy.
Go for it. No, I was gonna say, we would take 4 questions, but we just wanted to be aware of everybody's time. JC and Gabriel, thank you so much for your discussion. It was really amazing to hear a little bit more insight into your. So yeah, so if everyone was here in person would follow me, and we're gonna walk to the front of last year's exhibition so that we can start there. Right, just gonna wait a few more minutes for everybody else to gather around. Good. Okay. All right. So now we're going to start part 2 of the artist talks. And we're currently standing in the middle of Katya Grokhovsky's installation, Fantasyland. So before we start talking about the exhibition a little bit, I also wanted to remind everybody that Katya will also stage a performance for the very end of this exhibition on May 1st at 3 p.m. entitled Becoming American, which also, sorry? 4 p.m. At 4 p.m. I'm sorry. Excuse me. 4 p.m. Not 3 p.m. Information's on our website. And the in-person capacity for this event is limited, but we will also be streaming it on Instagram Live. So welcome, Katya. We're so happy to have you here. Just to give a little background on Katya, she was born in Ukraine and raised in Australia. And she is a New York-based artist, curator, and the founding director of the Immigrant Artist Biennial. Her work has been exhibited nationally and internationally. She's received support for numerous residencies and fellowships, including EFA Studio Program, the Museum of Arts and Design Studio Program, Watermill Center, and more. She's been awarded many awards and fellowships. She earned an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, a BFA from Victorian College of the Arts, and a BA in fashion from Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. So thank you again for being here. And also just to say that, you know, as Gabriel mentioned before, I kind of came into working here well into, you know, when these exhibitions were kind of going up. I'm not the curator of this exhibition, but Katya, you and I have had a long-standing dialogue about your work, and we've worked together a lot over the years, and so I feel really privileged also to be able to continue this conversation with you right now. So just to give a little context also for the people who are joining us over Zoom, Fantasyland is a site-specific installation made specifically for Smack Mellon's space, and which explores the rise and fall of a fantastical empire and its uncertain future. And you use a variety of different materials, including giant plush toys, inflatable beach balls, deconstructed and reassembled mannequins, a carousel structure, vintage parachutes, and also a wallpaper installation, a neon sign, and performance videos, which are incorporated back into the sculptures themselves. Like much of your recent work, this exhibition kind of takes a more like sardonic look at American culture and capitalism, but also the role specifically of women within that culture. And so I wanted to start by talking about the overall framework of the exhibition, which is this kind of, you know, theoretical, fantastical place called Fantasyland. So yeah, and it kind of presents itself as a sprawling playground. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit to start us off about how you came up with this idea, and yeah, like where is this place for you?
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And I wanted a few thank yous to Smack Mellon for hosting my largest exhibition to date. Gabriel, who initially initiated this conversation maybe 2 years ago now. So it's been postponed for 2020. So it's been, you know, in process for quite a while. And Rachel as well, stepping into this project. We worked together maybe 5 years ago, 4 years ago. At Solar 20, and we curated a very small solar exhibition at Solar 20, so comparing to this.
Totally.
But this is kind of, this project is, I would say, been in process since I came to America, which was 11 years ago now. Kind of ongoing, I think, through a lot of different processes, different exhibitions, different projects. Fantasyland originally comes from Disneyland, really. It's one of the lands in Disneyland. And Disneyland is a little bit of an obsession of mine, but you don't actually see that much in the exhibition. You see only maybe one character that you have to find, but it's actually a land that I made up. Fantasyland is the US to me. I grew up in Soviet Ukraine, so I actually never thought a theme park until maybe Australia. So I migrated to Australia first and then migrated here on my own. So I'm a double immigrant, and immigration has been with me most of my adult life since I was 15 when I came to Australia. So mobility and kind of detachment is part of my practice, which you can see in this show specifically. There's a lot of objects here that have been exhibited before, and they have been reinvented, reconstructed, repurposed, and have gone through almost migration themselves. So I kind of mimic my own life in my work a lot, and I have to also, I am a kind of a collector, accumulator, which you can tell, but at the same time, I have to discard objects. So Fantasyland really is a concept of this constructed land that I had to construct, I think, ever since I became kind of a person, a mobile person, an immigrant that's always migrating. And an immigration to the US, which I did through being an artist, has been in process for 10 years. And I'm a recently finally permanent resident. So I think this, it's a process, but this exhibition kind of is almost coinciding with that. It's almost a culmination of all these things that happened in my practice and all these things. I came here to study and I moved constantly, also cities in the US. So materials here are really mobile. So fabrics, bags that I've actually used to carry some of my work and objects around the city. A lot of things I've actually worn or I've performed in. So it is my land, but it's also it's an idea of America that it's fictional, and it's something that I was obsessing over when I was in Soviet Union. It was the beacon of opportunity. The US itself was presented as this golden promise, and I'm always interested in what that means. And also one of the first places I went to when I was here this was 20 years ago, I came here when I was 20 to do an internship in Hollywood, in Warner Brothers. I was in fashion in Australia. And I didn't know what I was doing. I really wanted to be an artist, but I didn't understand that yet. As an immigrant kid, I was just like, I need a job. So I came here as an elective of one of my subjects in BA fashion, and I did costume design, kind of helped on location at Warner Brothers costume department. And I spent 3 months in LA, and I absolutely was obsessed. One of the first places I went to was Disneyland. And I hated it and loved it at the same time. And I must say, that's how I feel about America. Very similarly.
Yeah.
Happiest place on earth, but also absolutely insane.
I think that really comes across in this installation. Like, there's something about it that's like equally, I don't know, like grotesque and also like attractive. Like, you want to be inside of it, but it's almost like too sweet to handle in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe elaborate a little bit more on this role of migration, kind of in the material process of your work. This, like as we mentioned before, you were the founder of the Immigrant Artist Biennial. This is something that's, does come up as a topic a lot. And yeah, so kind of like how this thing that's happened like in your life where you had to migrate halfway across the world, like multiple times, like how that affects your relationship to material things that end up back in your sculptures.
Migration, like I said, it's really embedded, I think, in my way of thinking. But it's also, I was thinking about this question the other day, that it also really, it was impermanent, the state of being. Thinking of migrating, there's a time clock, again, like sort of above your head. There's visa issues, there's constant thinking of ahead of time. Am I leaving? Am I staying? Do I have enough funds? I had to make a big decision. And at something? Do I apply for green card? Is this my place to be as an artist, as a person, as a human, as a woman, etc. So many questions. And of course, materials in that state of impermanence really came into play in my practice, because I kept thinking, if it's too heavy and solid and permanent, where do I put it if I don't sell it? And sculpture is very hard to sell. Reconstructed, reinvented. Let's use materials like fabric and inflatable that come down flat, small, and stored. My state of being was constant. Do I need to get rid of this if I have to leave the country? But I want to play with sculpture. I love installation. It's sculpture and really being really physical. So this space is sort of a perfect playground for that. But finally, having decided that this is my home as an artist and as a person, I can settle into certain forms, into certain state of being. So I think some of the materials, some of the sculptures here are now permanent. But who knows, I have a destructive streak, I might cut them off at some point. Again, storage is also an issue in New York itself, and economics of storage, and et cetera. So there's a mobility to my practice that I actually love, but at the same time, it actually comes from necessity, which I think is a very migrant way of thinking. There's also a lot of reuse and a lot of economic decisions of, I have a collection of about 50 of these dollar store bags that are kind of peppered throughout. I really wanted to use them in a project, and I've carried so much stuff in them, they're now breaking, so I thought I'll save them. So it's a very particular way of thinking. I'll save all the plastic bags, and I'll reuse them. So we're kind of, I'm like looking right at it. One of the very particular bags in the sculpture that is well known, especially I would say in Eastern Europe, where people would carry goods to sell over border and bring them back. It's something that I grew up with, so I think these bags are universal, and they're very interesting to me. They're also so plastic. So that kind of idea of reusing them, making them into art and making them precious. And a lot of also materials in my work have lived through something. I think that's really important to me, because each piece has an aura of being used before, or lived in before, worn before, carried before. And it's almost this attachment, detachment, psychological feeling, like I'm attached to each and every single thing in here. At the same time, I have to let go. And that's a very immigration kind of, where I have done that before as a 15-year-old. From Ukraine to Australia is a very traumatic, where I had no choice. And letting go of absolutely everything. So I have no baggage, it's all in my mind. And the memory is very distorted now. So I think that's what you see here is a lot of that idea, a lot of thinking through, a lot of elements I kind of started, discarded. So they kind of, paintings and sort of canvases embedded in here, because I'm a painter as well, which I didn't want you to see. So they're like in there. So that's kind of where my idea of reuse and sort of mobile practice comes from.
Yeah, I think that that definitely seems very visible here. I think there's also like this other element that we discussed before a little bit, which is that moving particularly to the United States, material goods are like available in different ways here than they are in like other parts of the world. And so you had this like ability to also like gather things in ways that like maybe wasn't possible before, or maybe was more disposable or cheaper. Exactly.
Very much cheaper, because Australia, for example, is so far that a lot of things coming from here, from China, are more expensive. But also the idea of discarding of very usable objects. I mean, I think I furnished my apartment when I first got to the US from the streets. I mean, it was not anymore, but it was especially in New York, but especially now in the pandemic. But I think before I was absolutely just had IKEA bags at night and would just go, especially on stoops, and collect all these things. And the idea of reuse for free and objects that are still usable, it's very, of course, it impacts the environment, but I couldn't believe that idea, because I think Australia is very ecologically, they think about ecology much more than environment. So they don't actually allow that kind of to happen. There's days where you have to, they will collect, the city will collect things, and that's it. So you don't see any street kind of these craziness. But there's also coming from Soviet Union, where everything was scarce. So anything that is on the street is gone in a second. You'll never see it. So my kind of, I just sort of started collecting, just blew up in that session with materials that are freely available, and they're all very cheaply available. And you see that here, there's a lot of those materials and novelty items like giant beach balls. Clearly I'm obsessed with.
Just to like pivot a little bit really quick, I think, going off of this idea of like reusing things, recycling them, and also kind of reusing different elements of things like within artworks later. I wanted to actually talk to you about this video that's right behind us over here, called Bad Woman. So this is like something that I consider to be an iconic Katya Grokhovsky piece. I've personally seen it in different iterations, in different forms, in different installations and exhibitions throughout the past few years. It's something that is very familiar for me about your work. It's like a symbol of your work in a way. And so, yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this video, kind of its placement within the exhibition itself, and also kind of the way that it relates materially to the rest of the exhibition.
Well, this is, I would say it's one of my greatest hits, I guess. I have exhibited this a lot. Bad Woman itself was born, well, it's kind of a play on Nasty Woman, but she was born, early to 2017, basically post-election of Trump. And it coincided with my decision. I was applying for my next visa, but I had to make a decision to start applying for green card and thinking of the home and permanent home. And also, anyone who knows immigration, it takes all your money. Everything I've ever said is I am in immigration debt now, because especially in this country, it's extremely expensive. It's very difficult, takes a long time. So I had to really come out with a decision. Do I stay? But of course, my practice to this point has been here. I went to grad school in America, so my practice has really been here, and I wanted to continue to be in New York. So basically, but the Trump election really kind of stopped my way of thinking in that regard. And I went back to Australia, spent 3 months in my parents' house, which is where she was born. This is my parents' backyard. It's also nowhere land. It doesn't matter if it's my parents' backyard, it's filmed. It could be absolutely anywhere. It's suburbia, deep Melbourne suburbia in Australia. But I spent 3 months kind of really thinking about what my future holds and whether I want to continue in this country, because I didn't really know this country until I knew this country, and I'm still learning this country. So I think she was basically born out of rage and out of my kind of subconsciousness. And she started this way of thinking of characters and personas. So she is a persona. She is Bad Woman because she's also cross-cultural. She's thinking where I come from, because I was spending time with my parents and I'm an only daughter who lives across the pond, and I am, I don't live a conventional life, basically. So I am definitely a Bad Woman. I have not reproduced. I'm not planning to. I don't have a family. I'm single, etc., etc. I've always wanted just to be an artist and be this vehicle for art and live in New York City. So here I am doing this. But she came out from conversations with my parents, with my grandmother, but they would leave me alone because it was right there. So I think, and I spent time in my teenage bedroom, and you go back to that kind of cocoon. But I'm a grown-ass woman, so I'm thinking, this rage, but also this, I wanted a mask, so I made this kind of clown mask. It's oversized, it's heavy. I'm wearing my mom's 90 that's dipped in red ink. I'm wearing my grandma's fake fur coat, so it's kind of kitschy, kind of based on the women that I was talking to in my family, but also this idea of, I have a fashion background. So it's sort of set up almost like a suburban fashion shoot, which I've actually seen a lot in Ukraine. But mostly it was done in like a living room, you put like something behind you and a carpet on the wall, like I grew up with, and do like a glamour shoot. So it's based on that idea of wanting to be so glamorous, but living in a very sparse environment and having no future. So she is locked into that environment. I also had a small solo exhibition with her in Australia, and I solidified all these objects and what she's wearing and everything she's sort of surrounded by into an installation of sculptures. All of that lives in my parents' backyard, my parents' garage, which is behind me. And these are my mom's curtains, you know, all these things were just around me, and some IKEA furniture that they still were holding from my years, student years over there. The garage is typical immigrant, right? It's absolutely full of everything I've ever done and touched. They also have a problem. I think my whole family has a problem, and it's not even hoarding, it's attachment issues. You know, everything, because I don't have a childhood sort of baggage that we brought with me. So everything there is the only thing as a teenager that they even IKEA furniture. So this chair is like IKEA chair that I exhibited, and now it's sort of embedded in this video. It's embedded in a sculpture. And that woman is she's here. She is a resident of this land. She is a feminist. She welcomes you. She's the first thing you see. So she welcomes you into the space. It kind of sets this kind of darker, grotesque tone for me, like a slightly absurd. She really definitely is the queen of the space. And she's sort of gone through a lot of iterations. I've performed her live a lot. And her mask and wig are actually in the space as well. Because I'm starting to kind of deconstruct her. I haven't performed her live for a while because it was too much. Couple of years I've been just performing her on and off consistently, mostly in New York.
So we can like almost consider this exhibition like the retirement party
Yes.
of Bad Woman in a way.
Yes, she's embedded in the video, and I think that's where she lives now. But of course, she is me. She's a shadow of me. So there's always that rage and that kind of badness, which is also rebellion, of course. And as a woman, there's always a double everything. There's always something waiting here, whether I'm young, old, it doesn't matter. There's always something I'm not doing right. So I think that's kind of that shadow, and she's always locked in. And she's, of course, you know, really, I was thinking of like someone like Paul McCarthy, right? Like a lot of people mentioned, but that's as a woman. Mm-hmm. So like grotesque, absurd, and also free with her body, and just like, why can't we do that? Mm-hmm. Why can't I be ugly? You know, so that's where she comes from. She really comes from rage, contained, but she's silent in this. Yeah, she has no mouth.
Right. Yeah, and there's I think maybe just kind of like thinking about moving on from this. Maybe we should pivot back to the sculpture behind us as well. We're just gonna like keep going deeper into the installation over here. I wanted to talk about this sculpture, which is titled "Becoming American," which is the same title that your upcoming performance has. And you know, if you those of you on Zoom can't see this, but for those of you here, there is a video mounted to the back side of the sculpture that kind of is the first iteration of this kind of performative. So this one I wanted to point out also, because this is kind of where the remnants of Bad Woman kind of ended up, is like scattered throughout this mannequin, the sculpture, but also the remnants of the performance, Becoming American, are also within it as well. And so, I guess I just wanted to see, can you talk a little bit more about the sculpture and how you developed that into Becoming American?
So this sculpture it's been exhibited like several pieces in exhibition. I think 3 times before, in 3 solo exhibitions before, just as a blue mannequin itself. So over time, it accumulated more and more objects, and a lot of my sculptures do that. They sit in storage for a while, then I put them back in the studio, and I kind of attach things to them. So with this one particularly, because I did a residency in 2020, December 2020, in full isolation. On my own at the Potato Farm Project, which is collaboration with EFA, Elizabeth Foundation for the Art Studio Program, where I'm a member. And I spent every day, and it was sort of snowstorms and cold, but I spent every day on this property on Long Island, thinking about receiving green card, which happened during pandemic, but I was already, long story short, the last 2 years I've been on a temporary green card, which doesn't allow you to leave the country and just wait for the last, it's a long, and then pandemic happens a long process. So during pandemic, when I can't go anywhere, I received my actual permanent card. And it was just so ironic that I didn't feel any of it. And I felt so isolated and alienated and lonely, as a lot of us did. I still do, I guess. So I was thinking of what does it mean to actually be here now and to have no longer the time limit over my head and to be American, because I still don't, nobody knows what that means. But so the idea of becoming, always becoming, because an immigrant is always not where they come from and always becoming something. And what it means to have this identity that's always changing and moving. So I was I brought a lot of objects, a lot of like this yellow tarp fabrics I've been playing around with. I just kind of started wearing them, all these things around the property and filming myself. So I filmed a lot of different videos. So one of them is here on the back. And then when I came back to New York and I was thinking let's continue working on this exhibition, I incorporated materials from that performance onto this mannequin. So I started dressing it more and more as almost like acquiring armor. And so there's a mattress strapped to the back, so that which has a TV. So it's like more and more things. The massive yellow tarp. There's a teddy bear embedded here, and there's the dollar store bag. And it's carrying, if you look carefully, it actually has the Batwoman mask and the weave right inside the bag. So it's kind of they're talking to each other. But this character, and also this is the actual character that has Mickey Mouse relevant. It's right on the head and has one glove, and that's it. But I was thinking of this, it's almost, they're all me, I guess, but it's another shadow of this mannequin, this like kind of no identity. There's just human, there's just a carcass, I can never say it properly. A skeleton that I kind of keep accumulating and kind of piling things on. So the performance that I did on Long Island was just like silent gestures, was just sort of this. There's always humor in my work, but there's some sort of gestures of trying to find something. I'm sort of digging or playing with snow. There's no face. It's just me and this tarp trying to fit in, but never fitting in. Always feeling quite the other. So I think that's in this sculpture. I'm thinking about performing this live. And it's a new, totally new work that I'm creating. I now think of performance very differently because I like to really focus on the commission. I like to focus on a new, totally brand new performance, maybe once a year. And this is that performance where I wanted to, like a grand finale, I guess, of this project to kind of activate the space. And I'm working with other artists as well, which is something that I've been meaning to do. And I did that before pandemic, but now I'm really focusing on different mediums. So I'm collaborating with an artist from Texas who was my student at SVA last summer, Sarah Martinez. She's creating a new sound piece, which is very exciting, with kind of elements from this installation, but she's sort of took it and run with it, so I'm going to perform to it. And then I'm collaborating also with a dancer, Lila Goldstein, who's from Israel, also an immigrant, who will be activating the space of movement. But all of us are thinking about what it means to be American. Whether you're from here or not, it doesn't matter, because reality is that none of us are from here, except if you're actually from here. You know, that kind of constant dichotomy, who is actually American. And when I say American, I actually think of Latin America as well. I do think of larger, just this side of the world. It's new to me. So that's kind of where I'm sitting with this work. And my mind is really kind of thinking about my future, I think.
Yeah, and maybe that's also just to like add one more thought to that before we open it up as well to like audience questions. But you kind of are hinting towards this thing that this whole project is a big like culmination of the past like 10 or 11 years of work, and it's kind of almost like a closing out of something for you.
Right.
And, you know, everything kind of, it's like the greatest hits are here. Like it really like embodies like the way that you've been working over the past, you know, decade or so. And so I guess I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about where you plan to go from here. You know, a little bit, you mentioned the performance a little bit, but also like, what are your thoughts of like continuing now that you have this green card or settling a little bit more, et cetera?
It's sort of, I can talk about the permanent resident, but I think it's, as someone who's gone through it, it's such a big deal that it's hard to even sort of not talk about it, to get around it, because it affects my work as well directly and affects my life. But it definitely coincides with my way of thinking right now, where I'm thinking about legacy. I'm thinking about what does it mean to be local to this place, but being not from here, which is a lot of New York City anyway. But am I an international artist? Am I an American artist? My legacy will be here. This is where my home is for my practice. So that kind of is getting me into thinking about permanency and permanent materials, archiving, of course, because I've always been accused of not using archival materials enough. I do use them, but not enough. Also solidifying certain ideas in my work, certain concepts, moving into, dare I say, commercial market. I'm absolutely daring because I realize I cannot sustain always this kind of work. It's great to have this space, but it's hard to sustain. So, you know, I do sell my work, but it's always painting and drawing. So I am interested in also commercial market for my work, and thinking about sculpture maybe in a way that allows me to cast things and take all the time. So it could be acquired, collections, etc. So there is a permanency in my work I don't think it's ever really been there before. I always wanted to experiment as much as I possibly could, but I also rebelled. There's a lot of rebellion in my work, and I think it really coincided with being a woman and migrating on my own to the other side of the world, really kind of breaking away from certain bonds. And now I feel like, well, okay, that's it. I've rebelled enough. Maybe it's time I actually now establish a legacy that is also rebellious, but also has sustainability and future and some kind of, you know, yes, definitely the word legacy keeps coming up for me a lot right now.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, this exhibition is definitely, I think it's a third solo exhibition that's been using very similar materials, but also accumulating, like parachutes are new, the wooden structure is new, certain things, sculptures, there's 9 sculptures here, some of them are brand new, some of them are totally recycled. Videos are old, except this one is new. So there's new performance, so there's new and old and experimental and less experimental, but that's where I'm kind of sitting, is I don't want to ever remove the fresh experiment approach. I will always do that. But I'm gonna say it, I want to make money.
Really
And
becoming
no one's-
American, yeah.
And you know, in becoming American, I realized that I'm signing up to capitalism full time. I'm here. Sign me up. Sell me up.
Rebelling against your own rebellion.
It's
now.
kind of this loop that I realized recently that I can't. I'm right here. I'm in it. I can't. I have to be in it too. I have to accept it.
Makes a lot of sense.
It's otherwise, I can't survive. It's just we all go through that kind of process, whereas suspicious people in creative industries have to, you know, comply or you're out.
Definitely.
That's I think where I preach. That's why becoming American is interesting to me, because it's almost becoming capitalist and becoming a particular person where I never understood capitalism ever until I came to America, and I lived in Australia 15 years. Australia's not fully. So here's where I properly learned what it means. All the bad and good that comes with that, especially the last 5 years, I would say.
Well, we love seeing the bad with the good.
Yeah.
So, and on that note, should we open it up to any questions from anyone here?
Yes.
I really like the element of risk that's innate to your work since you're so experimental. And I was wondering if there were any unexpected successes as you were assembling the show.
Successes?
Okay, so I'm just going to repeat that really quick for the people on Zoom. You're wondering about the element of risk and also if there's like other successes within the work from that.
Unexpected successes.
Sorry, unexpected successes.
Yeah.
Unexpected successes.
Yeah.
Interesting. I think really, you know, it's interesting, I'm looking at the orange cords, which were very much part of the space. But well, I wanted to say, yeah, also if you're looking that way, the ceiling and the installation of parachutes, which was hard to do. It's never easy, these kind of installations where you really have to design it before, but then the space dictates and technicalities, etc., and the weight and light and trying to dye them in the studio in buckets, not seeing them fully ever. So the success, I think that's where it happened. And then I wanted to play with, you know, the volume of them with beach balls under the parachutes. To me, that was unexpected. That came on the space, at the space actually. And how it fills the space was also a success for me because I always imagined it one way, but when you get to the space and you start blowing up the beach balls, you realize they actually do fill the space pretty well. So I think the contradiction of like, I was of course taking on this kind of space, I was scared, but and that's where the unexpected success came from, that I was able to play with it and sort of not be too kind of, what's the word, thwarted by it, and just like let it, collaborate with me and sort of, and I've been here alone like many times to kind of in the space, but never, it's always surprising when you actually start installing all the tricks of the space. So I think the success, the unexpected success, is really understanding my own way, my limits as well, and the space itself, and collaborating with it and not pushing too hard. I think I tend to sometimes do that. So that was, I had to like step back, just like, okay, leave them naturally hanging, leave them be. So I think that's, yeah. I also wanted to mention, I don't know if we can look at the neon sign, but neon sign was, this is my first ever neon sign, and I was really nervous about it because it's an investment. But I really wanted to, and so it's my handwriting, and I was insecure about it. So I've gone through so many iterations, and I had to really let go of my certain insecurities about having my hand as someone who writes differently. I think my cursive Russian, my first language, is quite different. So I was really conscious and had a lot of nerves about it. But that was, had to let go and just like solidify it and, lose control, get it to the company and just say, this is it, this is the handwriting. Yeah, so I would consider that a success in the end. When it went up, I was like giddy. It's just like, that's my handwriting, but it's also, kind of neon and fragile and beautiful and hey. So that was a point for me that was really interesting to play with.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about beach balls, because when you were talking before about like Fantasyland as your idea of America, I just noticed that some of the beach balls are a little less inflated, and I'm wondering if like, does that have to do with like this inflated sense of what America is, and like the deflation kind of a common theme in general, like the parachutes are deflated. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about that.
It's both by design and by accident, because if you see this beach ball, I'm actually leaving, it's going flat. I'm leaving the B, there might be by the end, just kind of halfway. They are not designed to last. I've used them 3-4 times before. They deflate quickly, as we find out, but also they're quite old. So that's where you have to inflate it back on. So But my idea of deflation is definitely here. I wanted to also mention that it looks like you come in and it looks like a party just happened and it's the next day. And no one wants to clean.
Like you missed the part.
You missed the party. The balloons are, you know, slightly, there's that feeling. And I think it's the feeling of this country that everybody found out the last 4 years what it's really like. I didn't know. I think that's where the deflating this like shiny surface that presents, as someone who was dreaming to be here her whole life, it presents itself very differently. And then inside, it's empty, a little bit deflated, a little bit decaying, there's decay here as well. There's definitely, you know, they're gathering dust a little bit, they're definitely sinking in. The parachutes have been, they're used parachutes, there's canopies, so they're kind of, no one's flying anywhere. No one's going anywhere. There's that heavy feel. It's definitely one of my favorite feelings is that the next thing. I can't quite describe it, but it is in my blood. This slight decay. Definitely. And you wouldn't think beach balls are decaying, but they're novelty items. These are 12 beach balls. They're supposed to be played with on the beach once. Put a little cut in it, it's done. And then it's a massive amount of plastic that lives forever. So that is interesting. We're technically using this sculpture as a form. I think we're using them as actual material because there's so much of it. And I store it and then that's the deflating situation.
I think are there any questions on Zoom?
Oh,
Yeah, there's one question from Zoom. So Shelley asks, is there a story behind the red striped tie that you were wearing today?
Oh, that's so funny. I knew she would ask that. Shelley's my mentee from SVA, my student. Yes, because I think I'm wearing it third or second time for the opening. It's my dad. I know it. He tied like so. I also don't make the knots. I collect. Just last time I was in Australia, I took like 3 years ago. I took all these ties from him, and that he wasn't wearing. It's like vintage stuff, old stuff. And I asked him to just tie all the knots. So I have a collection of them sitting here. So I never touched the knot. I just because I don't know how to do it, but I also like that he did it. So it's a little bit of a bad knot now because I've been using it so much. I don't want to do it ever. I do have like a little bit of, you know, yeah, parents because they've been my cheerleaders this whole time and have really helped me. You know, I can't imagine they have one child, like how they let me go. I don't know to this day, but I'm here doing it. And yeah, so there is a story. I think Kelly had something.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. It's great. We talked a lot about the multimedia you're working in, the sculpture, the performance, the video, but I'm wondering about the wall pieces, the paintings on the wall. And is that something that's created kind of like to enliven the set, or are they separate? You know, what was the process when you were painting them, and kind of how do they relate to the other works?
It's all like I think of installations holistically. So everything I was thinking of the walls constantly, consistently, how to activate the walls, but also how to bring everything together. And I designed. It's almost like a tour. So you go around and you encounter a different thing every time you look. There's different points of view everywhere. But in terms of a little bit about the background of the actual images, it's a collage that's created from other collages and digital paintings that I've done in 2020 when I lost access to my studio and materials, and I just was on my laptop every day. And I learned sort of digital painting tools. And these are actually, if you look carefully, there's a Mickey Mouse right there, I forgot. They're kind of pixelated and old snapshots of theme park, kind of families going to theme parks that I sort of painted over, collaged over, and then printed very large on sheets of photo wallpaper and brought here and cut on site. And then played with paint and the collaging of the photo paper. So they are painted on site as paintings and murals to activate, to kind of help, sort of have this immersive experience, and also really activate the space separately. I wanted everywhere you stand in a space, you have a different, interesting point of view, something new. And they are, they're basically 2020 movies playing with, and I'm making, I also printed some of them on fabric, which I'm using to make the costume for the performance as well. So because I was on the laptop, I really, once I had the studio at the FA, I really wanted to bring them large and get off the screen and see what happens. And that's why they're so pixelated and so kind of, they're also really small. I wanted that kind of decay again feel. And also almost, they were from the 70s, I realized. the snapshots that I painted over. I think I was attracted to the colors. And also I was born in the 70s, so I guess that was. And never went to Disneyland as a child. I went as an adult. So yeah, I think that was where that kind of came from. But I really also wanted them to be more abstract, so you can kind of find things like my sculptures, really kind of echoing that idea of collage, and ephemerality. I say you have to paint over them and take them down. They don't survive after this.
Excellent. Well, I think that's kind of all the time we have for today for questions and everything. I just wanted to say thank you again, Katya, for being here. Also, thank you, Gabriel and JC, for your talks as well. The exhibitions will be on view at the space through May 2nd. So those of you on Zoom who have not seen them in person, please come and visit us. We're open Wednesday through Sunday. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming and joining us today.
Yeah, and come to the performance or join us on live on Instagram. May 1st is the activation of the space through new commissions, new works, new people. Very excited, right, about that. But thank you so much for having me, and Rachel, Gabriel, everybody at Mellon.
Yeah, thank you. All right. And that's it.
Literally. I can't.
I can't.